All right, well, welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon with Dr. Cole Tutino, who teaches music and cello at New St. Andrews College. And my name is Mark Reagan. I'm the director of the New St. Andrews Conservatory of Music. And I'm just here to greet you and facilitate a few things today. As you can see, Dr. Tutino has his cello there, and he's going to do some playing for us, as well as some talking. And I will help to ask and facilitate questions a little bit later on. And I'm just here at the beginning to offer a greeting and welcome you to this. Very excited about this. A number of weeks ago, Dr. Tutino presented an online recital, which was a lot of fun to see. And he played this very piece that he's going to talk about today, the third cello suite by Johann Sebastian Bach. And he did this completely on a completely voluntary basis. It wasn't something that we put him up to, but he was wanting to do this recital to reach out to people who at that time, at least, were very isolated. And I know that many people around the country continue to be isolated because of the COVID virus. And so we're grateful that he did that. And he's just going to go into a little bit more detail about that piece today. And we hope you enjoy that. What I'll do is I'll just give you just a few words in terms of who we are, what we're doing here at New St. Andrews with the Conservatory of Music. And then also begin in prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Tutino. So the Conservatory of Music exists to train musicians to serve the Lord faithfully and skillfully on their instrument or with their singing voice. And so our music programs start from early childhood, about age 4, and continue up into college. And so one of the things that Dr. Tutino will talk about a little bit is, toward the end of his talk, I think, is the Conservatory of Music's Certificate of Music program that we have. Many of you have probably heard of it, but I'll just mention it here. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is that we're still taking applications for the fall. So please check us out at our website, and I'll put this on I'll type this in the chat so you can see what I'm talking about. So our website is music.nsa.edu, and that would give you a fuller idea of what we do in terms of all our programs, including the Certificate of Music. Coming up this summer, we have our music camp, July 6th through the 11th for kids ages 5 through 18. That's an annual event that we do, which is sort of like Vacation Bible School with a strong musical element. And I don't know, all the Vacation Bible School programs that I've ever been part of it growing up or as an adult have always involved some kind of singing. But this music camp is singing driven, but there's wrapped into that with whatever theme that we're talking about for the year is there's always lots of scripture and scripture songs. And this year's theme is going to be Schola Cantorum, which just means singing school. And it'll be an exploration about how the church historically has trained children, musicians, and singers to serve the Lord faithfully in his worship. So that's our music camp, July 6th through 11th. And then one other thing I'll mention is we have a teacher training that we run every year, and this is our 3rd year of that, called CSMI, which stands for Chenanaya Summer Music Institute, which will be in late July. That'll be July 20th through the 31st. It's a 2-week program that we use the Kodai method. The Kodai method was invented and very it's a very tried and true method, but invented by Zoltán Kodály, who was a Hungarian composer, musician, who saw that performers in his own country were more or less musically illiterate. They could play at a high level, but they didn't understand music very well. So he created a curriculum and a method to train children from an early age to understand music, basically through play and singing and activity, and not necessarily through a direct grammar of music. And his theory was that music should be learned just as a mother tongue is learned, that we learn our native English here in America, not because our mothers give us grammar lessons from the day that we're born, but because they talk to us and they play with us, they bounce us on their knees, and all those wonderful things. And so we learn English that way through lots of just regular activity. And so music should be taught from that perspective. So the Chennai Summer Music Institute is where we train teachers to be prepared to teach students in that method, and to equip them to be able to carry out a full-fledged music program in their schools. So that please check that out also on our website, music.nsa.edu. And let me introduce Dr. Tutino. I'll open in prayer, and then I'll let him do the rest of the talking here. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for giving us this day. We thank you for your protection. Thank you for, even during this time of isolation, that you give us things to do, things to challenge us, to grow us, to stretch us, to fill the capacities that you've built into us as your creatures. And we thank you for music. We thank you that it's a rich gift. We ask that today would be glorifying to you and enriching to us. Help us to understand Bach better, to understand how he wrote for the cello, to understand the music that he wrote to your glory. We ask you be with Dr. Tutino as he passes along this information. Pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So Dr. Tutino, I'll let you, perhaps you could introduce yourself just a little bit before launching into the music. This is your first year teaching at NSA, or the end of your first year. And what do you do for NSA?
Right, thanks, Mark. Right, so who am I and what qualifies me to be given this talk? I moved here from the Midwest, from Ohio, to come teach here, and I've really enjoyed my first year teaching at NSA. I, of course, teach cello lessons here. So that's one of the private lesson offerings we do. I also teach music theory to freshmen and sophomores. So every freshman that comes in to NSA will take music theory. So I'm an instructor of that. In addition, I conduct the NSA orchestra, which is a relatively new and growing ensemble. And aside from that, I perform a recital a year for the NSA community. So I've been really, really enjoying that. So let's get into this talk. So I've titled it From Page to Performance. From Page to Performance. And go ahead and share my screen here with you all. And so what I mean by page to performance is we musicians, we start out, if we read music, we start out with a piece of sheet music. What is the process from going from this page of sheet music to actually realizing that in sound and performing it? We're gonna have kind of an under the hood look at the mind of a performer. What goes on in a performer's mind when he takes a musical score, makes all the decisions necessary to make that into sound. We're going to look at that process specifically with one of my favorite pieces, Bach Cello Suite number 3. Okay, so I'll play a little bit of that for you and talk about some of the decisions that I have to make when playing it. Okay, so we all know the name Johann Sebastian Bach. Just helpful to think of his birth and death dates. Throw a couple dates out there. So he died in 1750, so for reference, he died 26 years before the American Declaration of Independence was signed, just for a time frame there. All right, cello suites. What is a suite? First of all, for our purposes, we'll define a suite as an ordered set of instrumental pieces. Ordered set of instrumental pieces. So Bach wrote 6 so-called suites for the cello. Each of those 6 suites is a set of pieces. All right, so each of the 6 suites has 6 parts or 6 movements. All right, so that makes a total of 36 actual separate little pieces of music. It's kind of funny, if you Google the search term, that cello piece that everyone loves, if you type that into Google, it'll actually bring up Bach's first cello suite, because it's a beloved piece of music. Everyone, even if they don't know what it is, they've heard it before. That's the suite number 1, is this one. Right, so virtually everyone has heard that. Now you know that is Bach's cello suite number 1, the beginning. Okay, so we're going to talk about his cello suite number 3 today. All right, so a lot of deep and profound stuff has been said about the Bach cello suites. The great cellist Pablo Casals, one of the great cellists of the past, he said, "These suites seem to shine with the most glittering kind of poetry. As I got on with the study, I discovered a new world of space and beauty, and the feelings I experienced were among the," my screen is covered here, is it purest? "The purest and most intense in my life." That's quite a statement about a piece of music. All right, more well known is Yo-Yo Ma, who calls these Bach cello suites the cellist's Bible. There's so much wisdom in there. You can always find out more things, and it changes as you change. Bach was actually attempting to do something, writing for the cello, something kind of almost impossible. And this is typical, the way cellists these days talk about the Bach cello suites. They're just very, very special to us. It wasn't always that way. It wasn't always that way. So we talked about Bach dying in 1750. We believe that he wrote these pieces in the 1720s. It wasn't until about 100 years later that they were actually printed and sold throughout Europe, right? So Bach died, and like much of his music, these suites were sort of forgotten about until 100 years later. Finally, they printed it. But so we've been talking about this word suite, but here's an early printing, and the cover page says 6 sonatas or etudes for cello solo. All right, an etude is an exercise. So here we are 100 years after Bach wrote the suites, and they didn't quite know what they were or what they were for. Maybe they're exercises. Let's just put that on the cover page, right? So somehow we got from regarding them as exercises to these highfalutin quotes that we saw by Pablo Casals and Yo-Yo Ma. So something changed in the way people thought about these pieces. So what changed was actually Pablo Casals. Okay, in the 20th century, he was a great cellist, and as a young cellist, he went into a secondhand music shop and just kind of discovered a printed copy of the Bach cello suites. He says, oh, that's interesting. What are these? He takes them home and he totally falls in love. And he says what he says about those suites. And he decided, no, these are not exercises. These are not just meant to be played in private. These are meant to be played in public and performed. And he did so. He was the first to perform these as public pieces. In 1936, he made the very first recording of these pieces, and they were revolutionary, right? He played them. He had a lot of fun. He had a good time playing them. He played them like joyous and profound music, not like exercises. So we have him to thank for really kind of reviving those. And ever since, it's been part of every cellist's basic required diet. What we're going to talk about are some of the interpretation decisions I make when I study, practice, and perform this piece. So some of the most basic questions when approaching a piece of music: how fast should I play it? How loud or soft should various notes be? How short or long should various notes be? And the problem is, when you look at the sheet music, very little of that information is provided. Okay, times have changed. So if I look at a piece of music written maybe 50 years ago, composers are quite controlling. They tell you how fast to play. Sometimes they'll actually give you a metronome marking. So it's like an exact objective measurement of how fast to play, how loud and soft. All of this is specified in the score. I've played pieces of music where virtually every note had some sort of marking on it telling me this information. Not so with the Bach suites. Virtually none of it is provided. So how do I know and come to decide on these things? Part of that has to do with the structure of a Bach cello suite. So an individual suite has 6 parts, and they're all the same. The first movement's the prelude, and then movements 2 through 6. These are all kinds of French dances. All right, there's the French courtly dance tradition. This is all music from that tradition, right? So here at NSA, our students like to do ballroom dance, swing dance, contra dance, folk dance, right? And so if you're going to dance the waltz, that means something musically. You know that the beat is supposed to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, not 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You can't waltz to that. Same with the dances like the Allemand, Courant, Sarabande. That has a meaning for the speed and the rhythm of the dance. So those are clues about how they should be played. I'm going to start with the prelude. So I'll talk about the prelude a little bit, and then I will play it. The prelude is the only movement that is not a dance form. Okay, so what the prelude is about, historically, a prelude is just sort of a call for everyone to shut up and get ready to dance. Is also an opportunity for the instrumentalist to make sure his strings are in tune. Right? It doesn't sound very artistic, but that's the origin of a prelude. And so there's a lot of scales, there's a lot of going up and down the instrument, is getting ready for the dance. In the past, it wasn't even written out. You were supposed to make something up on the spot. So by the time Bach was writing preludes, he did write down all the notes, but it's supposed to almost sound like you're making it up as you go along. You're exploring the key. And so you do see a lot of scales at the beginning of the prelude. That's how the third suite starts, right? That's the call. All right, and again, the question of how fast to play, that's a very tricky one, right? And we have, so what we're looking at here is the original handwritten copy of Anna Magdalena Bach. Okay, so we live in this amazing day and age where if Bach's handwritten copy exists, you can find it online for free, made freely and legally available. That's amazing, right? And so when you're playing a Bach suite, you could go to the store and buy whatever copy they have on hand, edited by whoever. These days, we're interested in what did Bach originally write? Go to the source. It's something we like to do here at this school too, right? If you're going to read Ovid, we're going to read it in the original Latin, or we have Hebrew classes, so you can read some of the Bible in original Hebrew. In music, we like to go to the composer's original writing. Now, in this case, we actually don't have the handwritten suites, cello suites of Johann Sebastian Bach. The closest we have is a copy made by Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena. All right, so Bach had two wives. First one was Maria Barbara, and after she died, Johann married Anna Magdalena, who was a singer and musician, and she copied out some of her husband's work. And so she copied out by hand Bach's suites for cello. This is her handwriting. So let's take a look at the prelude. Skip that for a second. All right, so this is the beginning of that Bach suite in Anna Magdalena's hand. And in terms of speed, there's another earlier copy made by another guy named Kellner, who was an organist. And that provides an interesting tidbit. So we see the word prelude, and we see the word presto. Presto in music means very, very fast. So I've heard all kinds of tempos. I've heard right, it sounds very grand, very regal. Interestingly, Kellner, he was a contemporary of Bach. He copied out these suites by hand. We don't know where he got the notes. Was he looking at Bach's original? Where did he get this? We don't know. But he puts this word presto. That alone changes a lot, right? Now, I don't know where he got the idea of presto. Did he get that from Bach? And Anna Magdalena left it out, right? She doesn't write it, but she was Bach's wife. You would think she was a closer source. So that presto indication, it doesn't really prove anything about what Bach wanted. All it proves is that that was an idea that was floating around at that time. So this is kind of the detective work that's kind of fun to do, looking at the earliest sources and what are the clues and the information that I can find. So what do? Do I do presto? I play it fairly fast, but I also leave room so that I don't have to feel like it's a race to the end. I want the flexibility of a prelude, the improvisatory nature of the prelude. So that's my approach right now, anyway. So this is back to the Anna Magdalena copy. So we've addressed sort of the question of how fast, got some clues. What about how long or short the notes are? So I'm talking about what I call the bowing problem, So in string playing, if I have a set of notes, I can play a different bow direction for every note. I could play lots of notes in one bow direction, which results in a very smooth sound. Or any combination. Right, the options are many. Now, what composers do to tell you to play multiple notes in a single bow is they use something called a slur. So these curved lines here, those are slurs. Any note that's above or below that slur is to be played in a single bow. All right, great. So if we look at the slurs of Anna, these 4 slurs, it looks to me like you have 3 notes under a bow, and then 2 not, and then 3 more under a slur, and then that third circle, that third slur, I think it's 2 notes under a slur, and then the last one, 3, I think. And you go on in the piece and you see that it's constantly like this. Throughout all 6 cello suites, the slurs are pretty unclear a lot of the time. Now there's a few approaches to this. So there's the approach of the cellist Anar Bilsma, who is a great authority in playing in what we call period practice, trying to play like people played in Bach's time. And he says, get out your magnifying glass and observe every single marking exactly as it's written. So I'll try that. It's actually really hard to do. It's highly irregular. Okay, string players are trained to do regular bowings. 4 notes in a bow, 4 notes in a bow, 4 notes in a bow. Not 3 + 1 + 1 + 3 + 1 + 2 + 1 + 1 + 3. All right, it's very, very tricky. And he wrote a whole book about this, using this particular passage and as an example. The book is called Bach, the Fencing Master. And he says that Bach was a fencer. And these crazy bowings are absolutely intentional because you're supposed to be like a fencer with your bow and with that kind of dexterity with the bow. There's not a lot of us who totally buy that argument, but again, he is an authority on Baroque cello playing. So that's one extreme approach. And obviously the objection is maybe it's supposed to be obvious that it's just 4 notes under every slur, but she's just being quick about it, right? So I have 3 girls. Some of you might be parents who are watching, and if I tell one of my girls to put her clothes in the closet, right, and she throws all her clothes in a pile, in the closet. I say, hey, why didn't you hang up your clothes? Well, you didn't tell me to hang up my clothes. You just told me to put them in the closet. Right? You know how frustrating that is. Do you really need me to spell out every detail of what you know what I mean? You know what I mean. Don't make me spell out every detail. Maybe that's what Anna Magdalena is saying to us. Don't make me be so specific, right? She had 13 children with Bach. Does she really have the time to be totally precise with every slur? Or are we supposed to just understand these as sloppily written, regular 4-note slurs? Nobody knows. Nobody knows the answer. The other extreme approach is to say, look, these are sloppy. We don't even know if they're Bach's. I'm going to ignore everything in here and do whatever I want. And that's how you get big, long slurs. There are obviously no big, long slurs in this passage, but there's many, many cellists who just take that approach. Right? It's unclear anyway, so I'll just make up my own. That's the other extreme. So what do? What I have gone through the piece and tried to observe every single marking. And then what I do is I basically improvise my own bowings, but in the spirit of generally shorter slurs. 3-note, 4-note slurs. But, right, so I'm not following exactly what may or may not be the information there, right? It's hard to tell. But trying to respect at least that in general, we have short slurs, right? And that's something that's clear. So that is the infamous bowing problem with the Bach suites. It's a giant debate among musicians, among cellists, and that's why you'll find for every cellist that plays this, you'll find a different interpretation. And for that matter, you know, Yo-Yo Ma has recorded this several times. So you'll listen to his recordings from this year versus that year, completely different performances. It's like it's a different person playing. And that's what he means, that they change as you change, right? So and I think it should be that way, right? We're changing beings. This music leaves kind of a lot open-ended, and so I think that our idea of how it's played can change as we grow, as we learn. Anyway, here is the prelude. I'll play the whole prelude for you. You know, some of the things that I've had to agonize over. Guess I should unshare my screen next time I play a movement so you can see me play. We'll do that. Okay, there you go. There's the prelude. So I talked about how I decide things like how fast, how long or short, which has to do with bowing. Let's talk about counterpoint and harmony. Okay, simply put, counterpoint is the relationship between multiple independent voices that sound simultaneously. Okay, so even if you can't read music, you can see in this example you have three horizontal lines, three different melodies going on, and a good composer would cause those three separate melodies to sound good when being played together. Closely related is the idea of harmony, which is the simultaneous sounding of notes to produce chords. So I'm going to play the Sarabande from this suite, and that's a really great example of counterpoint and harmony. So there's one part of the suite where you have, two voices. You have a bass line and a melody. So the bass line would go, and the melody and we're to understand them as two separate voices put together. The last thing you just heard was just a chord. So when Yo-Yo Ma says Bach was trying to do something almost impossible, he's right? So the cello was generally an instrument that plays one note at a time, and Bach is writing multi-voice music for a single instrument, right? He's all by himself. He's not playing with a keyboard instrument or anything. So Bach takes the advantage that we have four strings, so we can play four-note chords. And so the Sarabande has lots and lots of these chords. The important thing about harmony, when I study this piece, that affects what I would call color, right? Whether the sound quality, right? So harmony is part of the language of a composer. There are chords that are relaxing, chords of repose. There are chords of tension. Right, so that's a particular chord that's actually designed to make you a little bit uncomfortable, right? It's not so pleasing to the ear. So depending on what harmony is going on, I make decisions about how loud or soft or the quality of the character based on harmony. Again, this is the language of a composer to communicate emotion. Different harmonies communicate different emotions. All right, so the things to listen to in the sarabande. We have multi-voice music, melody versus bass line, and chords. So I will unshare my screen and then play the sarabande. Let's see. So there's the Sarabande of the third suite. So we're actually just going to listen to one more movement from this suite, and that is the final movement, the Gigue. And what I want to talk about in the Gigue is one of the other important things that I consider when interpreting this music, and that is French dance music. Like I said, every movement of a Bach suite, except for the prelude, is from the French courtly dance tradition. So on the left, you can see, right, this is not a tune by Bach, but it's an example of a bourrée. And then you see a chart of the dance steps and movements that would be done to a bourrée. Right, so here's part of a bourrée from the Bach suites. That's the style of music that the bourrée would be danced to. On the right, you have a minuet. Right, that means something different musically. Right, so a minuet, we have 3 beats: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't believe that the Bach cello suites were supposed to be danced to. Right? By this time, it's perfectly normal for an audience to sit down or be chatting and listening to this music, and there's no dancing going on. But for me, that makes no difference, right? So if you're listening to electronic dance music in your car, whether or not you're actually at a dance, dancing makes no difference as to the music, right? It's still danceable. So that's my philosophy with the Bach dance movements, that nobody's dancing to it, but it's danceable. So my goal in these dance movements is to get everyone's toe tapping, right? And so that is definitely my goal with the Gigue. So the Gigue is the last movement. A Gigue originated in Ireland or England. So we've heard of the Irish jig, Irish jig. These words are related, jig and Gigue. This man is not Bach, but he is playing a instrument called a musette. So you see there's this airbag that he has under his arm. So it's like a bagpipe where you squeeze this bag of air. It creates a drone, and then in his hands he plays the melody line on this sort of reed instrument. And I show this because I think that Bach is imitating a musette in certain parts of the Gigue. So the musette, you'd have a drone note and then a melody over that long drone note. So you all right, and so I think that Bach is imitating that style in parts of the Gigue where he does this. All right, so you have a single drone note that's constant with a different voice moving above it. That's part of that tradition, the musette idea. The other important thing in this jig is the idea of consonance and dissonance. So consonance is two notes that played together that sound pleasing to the ear. Those are consonant intervals. Dissonant intervals are a little bit more, they're designed to not be pleasing to the ear. They're designed to make you uncomfortable, or even, amazingly, Bach uses both of those intervals prominently in this suite. All right, and so what that means for me in interpretation, I believe you're meant to kind of shove the dissonance in your face. All right, so Bach was not apologetic in writing dissonance in this movement. So there's the dance feeling, the musette drone tone, and dissonance. So here is the jig. This will be the last thing I play. The jig from the cello suite number 3 by Bach. So there you have it. That's the G of the third Bach cello suite. Now, if you're feeling shortchanged, like, hey, what about the rest of the suite? I will be playing the entire suite at Grace Agenda. So come to Moscow, Idaho for Grace Agenda this August. We're actually doing a whole concert of all Bach, the faculty of the NSA Conservatory of Music. So I'll play this whole Bach suite. Our piano instructor, Dr. Ryan Smith, will be playing Bach keyboard music. Our choir director, Dr. Erb, will be gracing us with hammered dulcimer Bach, actually playing Bach cello music on the hammered dulcimer, but that's okay. And we'll be doing a Bach cantata with voice and orchestra. So Dr. Cody Lawn, our voice faculty, will be singing, and some of our students also. So come and see that. There'll be a really great time at Grace Agenda. And come to the NSA Conservatory of Music, right? If you're pre-college age, come do music with us. Like Dr. Regan said, we're about equipping God's people to do music excellently. If you're a parent, NSA, that's where you want to send your kids. If you don't have kids yet, our friend David Shannon likes to say, get married, have babies, baptize them. That's optional. We're not all Presbyterian here, well, but we get along. But send them to NSA. Thank you all so much for being here. I think we have some time for questions. I'll kind of hand it over to Dr. Regan to moderate those.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dr. Tutino. That was really very informative. The comments that you made about the pieces and the beautiful performances, even through Zoom. We were, believe it or not, actually able to hear some wonderful cello playing through through Zoom, and that's great. It's a great opportunity to be this close to some great performance and to hear firsthand about what you're thinking in terms of your preparation process. So those who are viewing this, if you have questions, we have a question and answer or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please chime in with your questions there, type them in, and I'll read them to Dr. Tutino, and then he'll go about answering them. And I'll just warm us up with a couple of questions of my own. So Dr. Tutino showed us some copies of early manuscript from the time that Bach was living. Do you, it sounded like you said that in your research, you and in your preparation to actually perform the pieces, that you actually spend time with the manuscript, as opposed to the other option, which would be maybe the easier one, is to find a printed edition of the music and play from that. And a printed edition, a lot of the decisions are made for you as a performer, because the editor who actually published that made decisions on how to articulate certain things or write certain things out so the performer knows what to do. So what has been your experience as you go to perform these pieces? Do you use manuscript? Do you use editions? Do you use both? How do you go about that?
Right. So in actual performance, I think it's important to note that I always play Bach from memory. Uh, I want just that freedom to just play, just make music. But yeah, in preparation, these days, the Anna Magdalena and sometimes the Kellner, those are all that I really consult anymore. So when I first learned these suites, we talked about the guys who will just kind of put whatever they want into the music because the manuscripts are unclear. That's the kind of edition I started reading off of, and it was fine at first to learn it that way. As I progressed in my playing and grew as a musician, it became more important to me just to be curious about the sources. And so yeah, these days, I mean, I have printed off copies of Anna Magdalena and the Kellner, and that's what I look at when I'm performing, just looking for ideas and clues about, you know, how could I play this?
Very interesting.
I would add that I don't do that with every piece of music I play, right? So Beethoven sonatas, I don't do that. But with Bach, because it's so unclear what the composer's original intentions were, and because it was so long before they were printed, I think it's important to just to look for those in the manuscripts.
So maybe a philosophical question is, what is Bach when you're playing a piece like that? If you you know, if you take the narrative that this is like Bach was a fencer and he's actually carrying out fencing technique or imitating fencing in the music, is that truer to Bach than, say, not looking at it that way? Or is Bach the composer lost if one interpretation is favored over the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very NSA question. What is Bach? And we love to talk about these deep things. So to take the extremes, what if we just ignore the source and we only take the notes and do whatever bowings we want? Many cellists of the past have done that, and I would argue that they're still playing Bach, but it's kind of like superimposing the style and conventions of one era and putting it onto another era. All right, so that's not necessarily wrong, but like if I were to draw a parallel to literature, I don't know. Well, it's like a Shakespearean play, and if the actors were to dress in modern clothing and speak modern slang, is that Shakespeare if the story is the same and basically everything, or should you use the original verbiage? Right, we would say if we're going to be true to Shakespeare in the style of that time, then let's use period dress, let's use his original language and words, if that's the goal. If the goal is to just take a semblance of Shakespeare's story and make it modern, well, that would result in a different interpretation of the play. I believe this music simply sounds better when we adopt the assumptions that Bach had. For example, long slurs, many notes in a single bow, they happen in Bach, but they're rare and they're in specific places. So if we start doing it all over the place, we are superimposing the style of one period of time, like the Romantic period, and putting that onto a period to which that was foreign. So I think what Bylsma, the fencing master guy, what he's absolutely right about is that the norm is short bows and separate bows. And so at least that, I think, does bring the music to life. He has the analogy of, playing with long slurs is like talking with your mouth constantly open, right? You get no consonants. So for him, separate bows is creating consonants, articulation, and that is a good thing. Now, what guys like Fournier and my teacher Starker in the mid 20th century, what they were after was not consonants. They were after the most voluptuously beautiful tone and cello sound that was possible. So that's why they did these big long slurs. My goal is not that. My goal is more towards, that articulation and life and sparkle that comes from the shorter bows. Right. So what is Bach? Well, I think we can have the notes and it's always there. It's always Bach. But the more of his markings you do, and again, we don't exactly know what his markings were, but the closer you try to get to that, the closer you are to what he likely had in his head, right? And that's one of the big debates, right? Should I care what Bach would have heard in his lifetime, what he heard in his head, or should I care about, speaking my own ideas, my own voice to today's audience? Right? That's a giant question, and something that I think all of us are grappling with every day when we practice and make decisions about the music we play.
Right. Yeah. Well, what did you say the fellow's name that the fencing analogy is?
His name is Honor Bylsma, Bylsma. Okay. And he did these suites, and he sounds great, right? It's incredibly hard what he's proposing to do, but he can do it, and he sounds amazing.
Yeah. And he plays probably on a Baroque cello too?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Okay.
Factor to it, right? Gut strings.
Yeah.
His bow is shaped differently. And frankly, it allows for much more dexterous kind of action.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, we have a couple questions here coming in. So Isaiah Evans, let's see. Isaiah asked a couple questions, so I'll ask the first one first, and then he has a later one too. But he says, do you think there was a particular reason Bach wrote them unaccompanied, right? So unaccompanied cello as opposed to accompanied. He could have written it that way. Do you believe Bach was able to play all the suites himself? So that's a separate question.
Right. Okay, so why unaccompanied? I think he did this as an experiment, right? So Bach wrote many violin sonatas for violin and keyboard. He didn't write anything for cello and keyboard, but he did write things for viola da gamba, which was kind of an ancestor of the cello with keyboard. But both for the violin and the cello, he experimented with writing for unaccompanied instruments. And I think it was really quite an achievement to do something that there had been unaccompanied music written before, but nothing to the extent of the counterpoint and multi-voice kind of writing that he achieved. We believe that he was living in, he was employed in Curtin at the time, which meant that, so the Prince Leopold, his employer, was a Calvinist. And we're not just talking 5 points of Calvinism, the tulip. We're talking hardcore Calvinism, which means church music is simple and no instruments, right? A cappella. So all that to say, he didn't have a lot of need for Bach to write church music. So Bach was free to write secular, courtly entertainment. So I think he was just, he was having fun and seeing, posing a challenge to himself in how convincing can I make a piece of music if there's no partner to the cellist. Could Bach play them on the cello? I doubt it. We know that he was able to play the violin, but like a lot of composers, it's very clear that he knew the capabilities of the cello. You could probably sit down and like pick out some things like, okay, is this possible to do? But we don't have any evidence that he had any sort of performing ability on the cello.
Okay. Well, looks like we have a question from one of your own students, Robert, is out there in Cyberland, and he asks, I noticed you adding ornaments onto the music the second time around. So you were adding to Bach, Dr. Tutino.
That's right.
How do you go about deciding when to add what ornaments?
Right, that's a very controversial question. So if you read anything by anybody from that period, the norm is, the assumption is, look, you're a musician. If you just do the notes on the page, you're a bad musician. You're supposed to decorate the music. Except with Bach, sometimes his music is written so densely that it's impossible to add anything to it. So some people do think that Bach was very specific in what he wrote, and you're not actually supposed to ornament it. So for me, I came to that decision just considering that the norm is you're supposed to ornament. And as Robert pointed out, so each of the dance movements has two parts, and each of those parts repeats. So what I do is on the repeat, in order to make it different and more interesting, that's when I add my own ornaments to the music. And deciding how to ornament, that's something I try to think carefully about. So I do kind of practice possibilities of ornaments, and then kind of whatever comes up in performance I'll do. But I am careful deciding, right? There are literally rule books from the Baroque period about how to ornament, right? If it's this chord, you can do this. If it's that chord, you can't do that. I haven't read it all extensively, but by listening to people who have studied this, and I've read some of the rules and things. When I was studying, I was an early music minor at Indiana University in grad school. So yeah, again, the harmony comes into play when deciding ornaments, but the decision to ornament comes from where there's places, there's space to do it. All right, so that's a requirement. If there's lots and lots of notes that Bach already wrote, I'm not really going to ornament that. But in particular, in the slow sarabande, I think there's some opportunities there. And so based on the harmony and kind of what sounds convincing to me is how I decide to ornament.
Good. Let's see. Isaiah's asking another question here. So how did he choose the keys that he wrote in? And is there a pattern? Is there a pattern to that? So what key is the third suite in?
Third suite, so all of the movements are in C major. That's a great question. So the first three suites are in keys that work really great on the cello. So G major. You notice it works really great on the cello because I get two beautiful notes without even having to use my left hand. Right, so these are the open strings. And actually, open strings are the best sounding on the cello because you have the full length of the string vibrating. C major, once again, uses lots of open strings, the third suite. And C also happens to be the lowest possible note on the cello, and Bach takes advantage of that throughout the suite. The second suite, D minor, again, it rings really well on the cello. His fourth suite was an E flat, which is very, that's getting difficult on the cello. That's much fewer open strings, so that we call the fourth suite in E flat major. We don't get to use as many open strings, so we have to use the left hand a lot more, and we have to use stretches. So we actually, the fourth suite is when we can actually injure ourselves. So how he decided that one, I think that it was probably the character of the key. So not all keys are created equal for composers, especially back in Bach's time. Every key had its own character, its own emotion, flavor. Now, there wasn't just one emotion per key. There's a lot of ranges. But like, for instance, I bet Dr. Regan could tell me, like, what is the happiest key in music, in Baroque music? If you want to, the pure joy, you're actually going to use a certain key.
Oh, I'm put on the spot. This is a quiz. Joyful key, D major.
Exactly right, or exactly what I was thinking. I'm so we're both wrong. Then we're both wrong. But yes,
well, yeah. I just think that a lot of Baroque, like orchestral music or vocal music with trumpets in it, is in the key of D.
And so that's a mistake. The happiest music, they go for D major. Bach's final suite is in D major, and that actually is written for a 5-string cello. That's a whole nother story. There have been theories, like with Bach's choices of keys, whether he's like, the key names like are code for a message. I don't really think that's true of the cello suites. I think obviously the G major, this is the first suite. It's kind of the simplest. We're using sort of easier keys to play to make sure that the cello rings well. As he progresses, right, to E flat major, he's just trying something different, see if it works. But also there's the emotional intent, right? So each suite as a whole, all 6 movements as a whole, each individual suite carries sort of an emotional unity, right? So there's a suite in C minor, number 5. That's a very dark hued suite all the way through. C major, the one we played, all the way through, it's quite open and sunny and joyful. So those are the things I think go into choice of key. And I think it makes a nice set too, right? If you look at the 6 suites, you have 4 in a major key and 2 in a minor key. So there's this emotional balance of major versus minor. And there's no repeats, right? So we don't get bored of G major because he wrote 2 suites in G major or something. But no, I mean, the topic of key is always a fascinating one. And I think that is something that informs my decision making. Even when it comes to tempo, you know, the choice of key, that's a major factor in determining, you know, the emotional content of the composer's music.
So how long have you played the 3rd suite?
I think I learned various movement at various times, but I think the first movement from the third suite I played was in 8th or 9th grade. So quite a long time. Yeah. And yeah, I look back to what I thought of it then, right? I think the Sarabande was the first one. So I played it much slower. I played it just very, very long and connected. My opinions have changed about it, but yeah, so I guess that would make, I don't know, 15 years is a rough guess. I'm not making a math mistake.
Do you have a favorite of the 6?
Favorite suite?
Is the third your favorite?
I would say, yeah, I think it is right now. Yeah. Well, no, the E flat is probably my favorite. The E flat's my favorite. It's not my favorite to play, but it's my favorite music. If that makes sense. So the music itself is my favorite, but it's much more difficult to play. But yeah.
Okay. And how many have you played? How many of the suites have you performed then?
So I've learned all of them. And I have performed the first 4 in their entirety. So I have not performed the 6th suite, partly because I don't even have the correct instrument. Right? I have a 4-string cello. It was written for a 5-string cello. Now you can play it on a 4-string and, play way up on the instrument. It's really hard. The 5th suite I hope to play very soon.
That's the C minor.
That's the C minor.
C minor one. Okay. Okay. So let me just interrupt with a non-cello question and just ask you to talk about the certificate program real briefly, and then Isaiah's got another zinger of a question, a controversial question, which we'll close with, but. Just tell us a little bit about the certificate. I know that you've said a few things, but like what classes are you do you teach for that? What other classes are offered? What do the students get out of their education going through that certificate program?
Great. So a couple years ago, we started this certificate track, which is add-on to a liberal arts degree at New St. Andrews. So certificate students take all the same classes as a normal liberal arts student, plus a focus on music. So they'll go through a music theory regimen. They'll get music history. We are introducing a couple of classes this next year. We're studying music of the German Reformation, so that students emerge with a knowledge of how the reformers thought about music and music in church. We have a class in composition and arranging, so students have a knowledge of how to write something original or how to arrange something in a new way. And all of our certificate students study 2 instruments. They take private lessons in a primary instrument and a secondary instrument. So they emerge with a fairly well-rounded musical education in addition to their liberal arts degree.
Very good. What do you like about teaching at NSA?
I'd say probably my favorite thing is very simple. It's that it's a place where we understand why we're doing this, right? We understand what music is for, and that is for the glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. That is why I'm here. That's why I was attracted to this place is because what we're doing is for the glory of God. Same with learning Latin, same with learning natural history and math. It's all to equip us to glorify Jesus in this world. And so that mission and that vision is why I'm here. That's my favorite thing about it. And you know, there's many things I could point to. The Christian fellowship that goes on here is just unmatched. Our students are constantly getting together and forging lifelong friendships with fellow believers. I love that. I love the people I work with. I find that the students are just so respectful and conscientious. So it's just really been a joy to work here.
Great. All right, so let's close with this question from Isaiah. Thank you, Isaiah, for your questions. So I don't know this, so forgive me if I butcher the question in asking it, but what do you think of the modernized versions of the Suite Number 1? And I'm taking this to refer to the prelude of the Suite Number 1, particularly the cello song.
Oh, yeah, I know.
And this is by the piano guy, sounding somewhat popish, written for 8 different parts. I personally do not like it, as I appreciate Bach's original score better. So what do you think of that, Dr. Tutino?
Talking about the YouTube sensation, the piano guys. Well, I think we have to understand he wrote an arrangement of the cello song, right? It's not exactly the Bach prelude, it's his own arrangement. But people have arranged Bach in new ways for ages. So that's, as long as we understand that that's what he's doing, I think it's kind of fun sometimes. You know, I think that so I'm not a purist in terms of like, oh, if they're going to be Bach's notes, we have to do it Bach's way. I think that we are creators, right? And I think it's perfectly fine to use previous material in reworking and creating something. So sometimes that's what we're doing, as in the case of the piano guys. Sometimes that's not what we're doing. In my case, where I'm playing the Bach suite as a Bach suite and not as an arrangement. But yeah, no, actually, there have been a number of composers that actually wrote piano accompaniments to the Bach suites and the violin suites. So those are interesting as a historical thing. Almost nobody plays them because it's like, why? Why do we need accompaniment for an unaccompanied piece? And then, of course, there's the mini trend, right? So Dr. Erb is going to play Bach cello music on a hammered dulcimer. That's great, right? I mean, I think that speaks to the Bach's skill as a composer, that it's universal, right? It's not, he wrote it for the cello. Everyone wants to play this music, right? I've heard it on tuba, I've heard it on clarinet, on piano, on violin. Everyone wants to play this music because it's simply great music, and more power to you, right? More power those who want to appropriate the cello suites for non-cello purposes. Again, it's simply great music, and so let's play it on whatever. Remembering that he wrote it for the cello first.
Yeah. All right. Well said. With that, we'll close today's webinar. Thanks for all of you viewing. Certainly, if you have questions about New St. Andrews, about the Conservatory of Music, the Certificate of Music program, our events, especially our summer events or Grace Agenda, send us a note. And what I'll do is I'll leave Well, I'll leave both of our email addresses here. So I'm the director of the conservatory, but I'll also leave Dr. Tutino's email address there in the chat. So if anybody wants to just reach out to us with questions, feel free to, and certainly our website too. So with that, we'll end the meeting. And thank you. Lord bless you. Thank you, Dr. Tutino.
Thanks, everybody.